Hey, thanks, Courtney. Glad to be here. I have several times heard James talk about the need for the public square, an online public square. And anybody who wants an online public square that desperately should want the government to create its own. Ask President Biden to create americaspublicsquare.gov, because that's a far better way to create the online public square that James wants than trying to nationalize private businesses like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and make them instruments of the government. James likes to talk about the interplay between the First Amendment and Section 230, but the First Amendment is clear. It says Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. So the government cannot force newspapers or social media platforms to carry speech they don't want to carry. And as for the argument that our First Amendment can be discarded because social media platforms are the public square, we've had courts in America confirm over and over again, as in Prager, when the court said that despite YouTube's ubiquity and its role as a public-facing platform, it remains a private platform. It is not a public forum that's subject to judicial scrutiny under the First Amendment. So look, I think the clear thing here is that the First Amendment protects social media platforms from Congress and from the state legislatures. It's not the other way around. The First Amendment was done 230 years ago this year, and Section 230 was only a 1996 legislative remedy because the real-life character in The Wolf of Wall Street had a lawsuit against Prodigy's bulletin board. More on that later, but 230 is not what's going on here. The confusion is rampant. Even the New York Times had to correct its story last week. Quote, an earlier version of this article misstated what allows social media firms to remove posts that violate their standards. It is the First Amendment, not Section 230, quote. Now, the Florida court, as you described, was not confused at all. When we sued to block that law on June 30th, the federal court enjoined Florida's law as violating the First Amendment. It intruded on social media's editorial judgment, and it compelled private businesses to host speech they don't want to carry. So if you quote the ruling, I think it's really instructive to James. Quote, the state has asserted that it is on the side of the First Amendment and that the plaintiffs are not. It is perhaps a nice soundbite, but the assertion is wholly at odds with accepted constitutional principles. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the press. And the federal court in Florida went on to block all of the content moderation provisions. So James, it's more likely that more of your recommended state laws will be blocked by the First Amendment, and we'll sue everywhere we need to. You will only be encouraging, therefore, moderation standards that you want to eliminate, because you'll simply confirm here what the federal court said, that state governments cannot violate the First Amendment by forcing social media to carry content they don't want to carry. So I'll close by saying that, James, if you really want to create a wide open public square, get busy on that and stop trying to nationalize private social media platforms that are just trying to create and foster the communities that they want to build.
That there are many people who feel that their ability to communicate freely on tech platforms, especially the dominant social media platforms, has been restricted, either based on viewpoints, whether you're a Palestinian activist or a variety of different points of view. Can you respond in 2 minutes?
Thanks, Courtney. As you indicated at the beginning, this is a squeeze play. There are elements of our government at the state and federal level who want more content moderation by the social media platforms, and there are elements who would prefer less content moderation. But neither, because of the First Amendment, neither can impose their will on private platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter. They are trying to build communities, and they will make value judgments over time in response to new and emerging threats. Who knew the Tide Pod Challenge was going to get teenagers' attention, right? Who knew that we had to prepare for a pandemic? And frankly, when you think about the kind of speech that they want to force these platforms to carry, when I testified in Texas against a very similar law that Mr. Taylor's been pushing, the only supporters, other than Heartland, were anti-vaxxers who wanted to be sure they could force Facebook, Google, and Twitter to carry lots of information about the dangers of vaccines to people on social media. And if those platforms don't want to carry that for their own reasons, if it doesn't fit their vision, then people are free to go to other platforms. There are zero barriers to entry to start a new social media platform. Rumble, Parler, MeWe, they've all been able to achieve millions of subscribers. And it's easy for people to join multiple social media platforms. And you can choose, therefore, to go to one that maybe has a light touch on content moderation. But beware, because the more awful but lawful content that is on a social media platform, the less likely it is for advertisers to want to see their ads displayed to that kind of content. And when the advertisers go away, I don't know who's going to pay to make that free for subscribers.
Steve, thank you. I want to come to you with a question about, I think that the community has felt for a long time, or not the community, there's no community, there are many communities, but many people have felt that there is not enough being done by the tech platforms to address the objectionable content, which includes harassment, it includes terrorism, it includes extremist violence, etc. And that we want or need regulators and policymakers to step in and provide some impetus for them to actually do more, because they're not doing enough. How do you address that?
Simplest way, Courtney, is if the government makes a particular kind of speech and harassment illegal, then all unlawful activity is acted upon right away for fear that the platforms themselves could become liable. And even Section 230 says nothing about criminal law. So the point here is that if the government wanted to say that Holocaust denial is illegal, you'll take a look at Europe, and nearly all the nations in Europe make that an illegal form of speech. It isn't in the United States, partly because of the First Amendment and Congress hasn't enacted something like that. Harassment in the US is an awfully old statute that really only includes credible threats of physical harm. We would need to expand that definition to cover something more than just credible threats of physical harm in order to capture harassment as illegal activity. But if you can't do that, the only thing left is to raise concerns to the social media companies, my members, and they respond because they want to keep advertisers and users happy. That's all we do, is bring advertisers and users together in an effort to build a business. The trick is that when we do that and we take action, we need to do so with our own judgment, try to be transparent and accountable, but with our own judgment. And that is inevitably going to create people that have a problem with it. People like James, who have a problem with certain decisions that are made on pulling down misinformation. The anti-vaxxers won't like if we try to regulate medical disinformation. So I think we are in a bad place here where we're being squeezed from both sides. Keep up the squeezing and work the refs, but understand that there's our forces pushing the other way as well.
So I would like to invite every panelist to give us your one key takeaway that you want people to think about when they think about how we should regulate content moderation, whether you're thinking about that from a government regulation, self-regulation, co-regulation, et cetera. What is kind of one key principles that everyone should keep in mind?
Users will decide is they'll be able to choose among platforms that have differing approaches to try to keep their community safe, keep their advertisers and users happy. We need to encourage innovation and experimentation by the platforms. And fortunately, they're protected from government action when they do that. And they're protected from a lot of lawsuits by Section 230. Now, at the same time, I do think the platforms should adopt new principles and standards to be transparent about what their community standards are. They should be accountable for decisions they make, and they should have a process of appeals. Maybe not something as grand and global as the Facebook Oversight Board, but everyday decisions made at Twitter and YouTube, they ought to be able to give people an opportunity to appeal the decision and learn why their content was taken down.